A military editor would read this as more than a sniper story. It is a war between doctrine and instinct, between institutional bias and earned excellence. Elise Thorne enters one of the Army's most brutal schools, carrying combat scars, grief, and a reputation no one wants to honor. What follows is sabotage, psychological warfare, and a final shot at 1,247 meters that forces an entire command structure to confront what it tried so hard not to believe.
Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne braced the M40, the wind whispering secrets most riflemen miss. The steel plate, a speck at 1,247 meters between two pines, was a shot they called impossible at Lejeune. For 4 decades, that target collected rust and mockery. Gunny Hessler was already logging her failure behind her. But she'd learned marksmanship in worse terrain from a man who was always true. His memory, a burden she carried through 2 tours and the long grief that followed. She imagined his steadying hand, a presence reaching from the Montana soil covering his grave. But this shot required surviving 3 weeks of hell first. It began 8 months back, in a Missoula hospital filled with the scent of disinfectant and the first bite of winter. Cancer had reduced Thomas Thorne to a silhouette against the window, a fire consuming him from within. Even at 68, his hands remained a sniper's rock-steady as his body failed. Elise gripped them, the calluses from 4 decades on a rifle a stark reminder. Her father's voice was a rough whisper, "Promise me." She moved closer. Beyond the glass, the bitter roots cut a harsh line against the gray sky. In those mountains, her church, she learned that patience was an act of will, not of waiting. A choice you forge into a habit. Anything, she promised. His eyes, still blazing with a sniper's intensity, locked on hers. "Finish it," he urged. "Be the scout sniper I never was." The words constricted her chest. In Montana, her father was a legend in the wilderness. He knew the terrain intimately, yet he'd never donned the uniform she wore for him. "I tried," she murmured. "Twice. 6 months down in Iraq, 4 in Afghanistan." He cut in, the waiver. "There's one more chance." His grip was shockingly strong. "Medboard cleared you. You have until March 2026, your last shot." He drew her nearer. "Make it stick, kid. Show them what a Thorne can do." 3 weeks later, she renewed that vow over his grave in the downpour. That promise was a live coal in her stomach now, on the edge of the Lejeune Ranges, as sunlight pierced the trees. The bus from Pendleton had dropped her at the gates in the pre-dawn blackness. 23 other hopefuls materialized from the shadows. She was the only woman. At check-in, the sergeant reread her packet. "Thorne, Elise. Staff Sergeant, 2nd Martiv." He sounded clumsy saying it. "You're here for the Scout Sniper Basic Course." It was a statement, not a query. She affirmed it. He slammed a stamp on her papers without making eye contact and nodded toward the barracks. His lack of words said everything. The squad bay corridor stank of gun oil, wax, and the quiet desperation of men who knew most of them would wash out. Elise found her rack among 11 others. The chatter died as she entered. A pretty boy corporal with a smug look watched her stow her sea bag. She ignored him. A nervous-looking PFC gave a short nod from across the aisle. She returned the gesture. Formation was at 0500. 24 Marines formed up on the broken asphalt as the sky lightened. Elise had taken a spot in the 2nd rank, hoping to blend in. A privilege she knew she wouldn't get. Gunnery Sergeant Brock Hessler stalked the formation like a predator culling a herd. He was a thick man, his expression a permanent scowl. His high and tight was flecked with gray, and his cold blue eyes appraised each Marine with contempt. He would stop, needle a candidate to make them sweat, and move along. He paused when he reached Elise. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he drawled, the name sounding like an insult. "2nd Marine Division," he said, glancing at a clipboard. "2 tours, Iraq and the Stand, a beat. Rifle expert, top shot in your battalion." His gaze met hers. "And medical waivers for 2 prior washouts. Shrapnel, a compound fracture." A humorless smile twisted his mouth. "So tell me, Staff Sergeant, what are you doing here?" Elise kept her eyes forward. "To be a Scout Sniper Gunnery Sergeant." "Wrong," he roared. "You're here 'Cause some paper pusher thinks we need to meet a quota. You're here to be a photo op for your CO. You're here 'cause the new corps doesn't believe in standards. He addressed the formation. Well, in this house, standards are all that matter. Quotas don't pass this course. Photo ops don't last 3 weeks. He looked back at Elise, his voice dropping low. I give you a week. Maybe. He stalked off, leaving her rigid, her pulse hammering as 23 pairs of eyes reassessed her. The dynamic in the ranks had changed. The corporal's smirk widened. The PFC with sandy hair glanced away. Nobody looked surprised. That night, she took a worn photograph from her wallet. Her dad, 12 years younger, smiled from a Montana meadow, rifle in hand, the smile she'd chased her whole life. Behind him, the snow-capped bitterroots stood like silent gods. She traced the worn crease with her thumb, a charm that had seen her through 2 wars. I'm here, she breathed into the darkness. Just have to see it through. She flipped it over. 3 promises were listed in her father's tidy handwriting. 1. Finish high school. Done. 2. Serve with honor. Done. 3. Become Marine Scout sniper. The line was empty. She closed her eyes, feeling her father's hand, hearing his last request. She had promised. In 3 weeks, that box would be checked, or she'd break. The next day's classroom session laid out the reality of her situation. Hessler paced at the front, his lecture on ballistics punctuated by glares in her direction. He asked about windage at 600 meters. She gave a perfect answer, using a method her dad had taught her before she understood the physics. He dismissed her answer as incorrect and continued. She tried to explain how to read a mirage. He interrupted to pick another Marine. Corporal Cody Vance offered a subpar response and got praised. The setup was clear. Her competence meant nothing here. But she'd learned patience from a man who could sit for 19 hours in the biting cold for a single opportunity. She'd learned quiet resolve from a father who said more with a glance than with a speech. And she knew you only gave haters a foothold when you let them inside your head. Gunnery Sergeant Hessler was determined to see her fail. He had no idea who he was dealing with. This classroom pattern continued for 3 days. Hessler would lecture, Elise would have the right answer, and he would dismiss her. The other Marines watched on, some finding it amusing, others just thankful it wasn't them. The routine shattered on day 4. A new instructor entered before Hessler. He looked to be in his mid-30s, carrying himself with the quiet assurance of a combat veteran. He wore the MARSOC Raider insignia. His gaze swept the room, a quick, practiced assessment of men. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb, he announced. I'll be assisting with your marksmanship evaluation. He looked at Elise no differently than at anyone else. He didn't treat her like a problem or single her out. It was a small thing, just being another candidate. But after 4 days under Hessler's thumb, it felt like relief. Webb started breaking down the tenets of precision shooting, his approach the opposite of Hessler's. Hessler commanded, Webb coached. Hessler dismissed questions. Webb encouraged them. His authority came from battlefield credibility, not from rank-based intimidation. He posed a problem, a target at 800 meters with a tricky crosswind, asking for solutions. Elise answered without hesitation. Her response was precise, a formula her dad had hammered into her. She factored in overlooked details, temperature impacting powder, high-altitude crosswinds causing intricate drift patterns. After she spoke, Webb gave a slow nod. Solid copy, he said, his eyes lingering on her for a moment as if logging important data. Hessler showed up then, leaning against the back wall with his arms folded, his glare fixed on Webb. After class, he cornered Elise by the exit. Showing off for the new instructor, he muttered, kissing ass. She refused to take the bait. He stepped closer, his voice low. Won't do you any good. Webb ain't grading your final qual. I am. She met his gaze for a hard 2 seconds before walking past him. In a battle of inches, it felt like a victory. That evening, Elise was walking the path behind the barracks as the oppressive heat finally broke. She was mentally reviewing wind calculations when she heard gravel crunch behind her. Staff Sergeant Thorne. She pivoted. Marcus Webb stood a few feet away, relaxed but alert. Sergeant First Class, she acknowledged. He gestured to the tree line. Take a walk. They moved out of earshot from the barracks. Webb was quiet for a beat, a silence Elise recognized. He was choosing his words deliberately, like selecting a round. That calculation today, he began, for the wind. You mentioned factors that aren't in the book. The statement hung in the air. A clear question. My old man taught me, she answered. He spent 40 years hunting Montana. Up there, the wind shifts every few hundred feet. You learn to read what the books don't tell you, or you come home with nothing. Webb nodded. Thomas Thorne. It wasn't a question. Elise stopped dead. You knew him? The name, not the man. Webb turned to her. Guys in that world talk about him like a ghost. Said he could make shots that defied physics. Said he taught his daughter everything. He paused, his eyes fixed on hers. They also say she might be better. Something tightened in Elise's chest. Her father was a legend. His name spoken with reverence in gun shops across 3 states. Being measured against him was an honor and a crushing weight. I'm trying to be, she said softly. Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke. Look, Staff Sergeant, I can't run interference for you with Hessler. The regs give him final say. But what I can do is make damn sure your performance is logged by the numbers. He met her eyes. If you shoot half as good as the legend, the paperwork will prove it. It wasn't a promise of help. It was a promise of a fair fight, and in a rigged system, that was her only weapon. Thank you, Gunny. Webb shook his head. Don't. He's just gonna come at you harder now. You challenge his whole worldview about women in combat roles. He headed back toward the barracks. There's something else, he said over his shoulder. Hessler had a sister, Caroline. Went to Ranger School back in 2011. Top of her class, PT stud. A shoo-in on paper. Webb stopped and turned back. Made it through the first 2 phases. Then she just snapped. A full psychological break. Started seeing things, totally gone. Medical discharge, psych ward, the whole nightmare. A cold dread settled in Elise's gut. He thinks I'm gonna break like she did. No, Webb said. Hessler is terrified you're going to break like she did. That's why he's pushing you out. In his screwed up mind, he thinks he's protecting you. He walked away, leaving her in the North Carolina night with a new understanding of her tormentor. Hessler wasn't just a bigot. He was a brother, haunted by a ghost. Understanding wasn't forgiveness. It was fuel. The news came at evening formation. Tomorrow, Hessler's voice cut the air, is your first live fire assessment. Known distance targets, 100 to 600 yards. Marksmanship fundamentals. The baseline that separates shooters from those going home. His eyes found Elise. I expect some of you will find this a challenge. For some, it will be the moment you accept you're out of your league. He smiled, a cold, empty thing. I look forward to seeing who falls. That night, Elise stripped her rifle 3 times. She confirmed her scope's 0 twice, then a 3rd time. She ran wind calculations in her head until the numbers blurred. Lying in her rack, she pulled out her dad's old photo. He stared back from a Montana meadow, the quiet confidence of a master frozen in time. Tomorrow, she whispered. Tomorrow I show them everything you taught me. She remembered the hours he'd spent teaching her to read the wind in the grass and the shimmer of mirage. She remembered being 15, nailing a 900-yard shot he called the best he'd ever seen. It was their last hunt before she enlisted. Now, 12 years later, she'd use every lesson to survive a test designed for her to fail. She flipped the photo. The 3rd line was unchecked. Asterisk, become Marine Scout Sniper. Asterisk, soon, she promised. Soon, Dad. The range at Camp Lejeune was a pale, flat expanse. Targets were set from 100 to 600 yards. 24 candidates took their lanes. The air was taut with nerves under a mask of military calm. Elise drew 17. Hessler placed himself directly behind her. She got into the prone, her cheek welded to the stock. Through her scope, the 100-yard target was crisp. But something felt wrong. The reticle was off, just a fraction, a hair's breadth. But she'd been behind a scope since she was 9. She knew her rifle's zero by feel. Someone had been on her elevation turret. She didn't move, didn't look back, didn't give him the satisfaction. She ran the math. If it's this far off at 100, it's a miss by a mile at 600. She'd have to hold over for every single shot. Trust her gut, not her equipment. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Asterisk. The rifle is a tool. Elise. You are the weapon. Asterisk. She fired. The round hit center mass. She adjusted by feel, not optics. Fired again. Center mass. 5 rounds, a group tight enough to hide with a quarter. Behind her, she could feel Hessler's confusion radiating off him. At 200 yards, she compensated again. The mental math got harder. She sent a round, adjusting off the dirt splash, not the crosshairs. Fired again. Her grouping loosened, but was still well inside the qual line. 300. 400. Each range demanded fresh dope for the sabotage glass. Sweat traced her spine, less from heat than pure focus. At 500 yards, her cluster opened up. Still a pass, but not what she was capable of. 600 was the final exam. This shot separated trigger pullers from hunters. Elise steadied her breath, running the numbers one last time. The scope was lying off by a full minute of angle. She had to hold almost 6 inches low. She fired. The impact blossomed on the target's chest, left of the heart. A hit, but sloppy. She adjusted on instinct and sent another, closer to the X. Her last 3 rounds punched a ragged hole, a group that would have been a miracle with a zeroed rifle. When the scores came in, Elise had qualified, solidly in the upper third. Webb read the results with a flat, emotionless tone. Hessler stood beside him, his face a twitching mask of disbelief and rage. Once the range was cold, Elise took her rifle to the armory. She detached the scope, checked the turrets, and saw it. The elevation knob was 3 clicks off her zero. Somebody had messed with her weapon. The cold reality settled in her gut. This wasn't going to end. Hessler would keep coming at her, trying to wash her out. Fine. If he wanted a war of inches, she'd give him one. Elise reattached the optic, dialed in her true zero, and snapped pictures with her phone. Next time, she'd have proof. Webb materialized beside her. Your scope was off, he stated, his voice low. Elise nodded. Can you prove it was tampered with? No, Gunny. Then my hands are tied, officially. Webb paused. But what you did today, qualifying with gear someone jacked up, most Marines couldn't do that. He locked eyes with her. And I'll tell you something else. It's only gonna get uglier. Elise gave a short nod. She knew. Webb turned to leave, then stopped. Your old man would be proud of you, Staff Sergeant. The words landed like a gut punch. Alone in the armory, she let the loss hit for just a second. Then she boxed it up and walked back into the humidity. 3 weeks. 3 weeks to survive Hessler's games and earn her place. 3 weeks to make the impossible shot. Target 17, she hadn't breathed a word of it, but her mind was made up. That target, the one no one had hit in 40 years, was going to be hers. Not for Hessler or Webb or the other shooters, but because somewhere under the Montana dirt, Thomas Thorne was watching. And she'd made a promise. The stalking phase kicked off Monday morning. Hessler briefed the candidates at the edge of miles of brutal terrain. This is where shooters get washed out, Hessler barked, his gaze on Elise. This is where we see who can hunt and who can just shoot. Marksmanship got you here. Fieldcraft is what will keep you alive. He gave a smile that was all ice. Out there, things happen. Dehydration, busted ankles, Marines get lost. The threat hung in the air. I expect we'll be losing a few of you this week. On paper, the stalk was straightforward. In execution, it was a nightmare. Every candidate had to low-crawl 800 meters of punishing terrain towards an OP crewed by instructors with high-powered glass. The mission, reach the FFP, ID a target, and take the shot, all without being detected. If they saw you, you were done. A single failure meant you repeated the evolution. 3, and you were washed out of the course permanently. Elise checked her lane assignment. A knot of ice tightened in her gut. Sector 9. She'd heard the hushed talk about it after lights out. It was the northwest quadrant, the most brutal ground on the base, where the rock's shredded gear and cover was a prayer. It was the lane they reserved for Marines they intended to break. Her stalk commenced at 0700. The initial 200 meters followed a shallow, overgrown ravine. She moved as her father had shown her, an inch at a time, feeling out the earth, becoming another shadow on the landscape. The memory rose unbidden. She was 12, lying prone in a field in Montana beside her dad, a mule deer grazing 100 yards away. His hand rested on her back, steadying her breath, his voice softer than the wind. That buck feels you here, Elise. He knows, but if you become the terrain, become the silence, he'll dismiss you. He'll decide you're not a danger. That's your window. She'd stayed motionless for 2 hours, every muscle fiber screaming, desperate to move, to do anything but remain perfectly still. When she finally took the shot, the deer never registered the threat. That evening, her father had called her a natural. Born with an instinct hunters spend their lives chasing. She hadn't understood it then. She did now. The middle section of her stalk was a meat grinder. The jagged ground chewed up her knees and elbows, drawing blood she didn't acknowledge. As the sun climbed, the heat pressed down like a physical burden. Sweat drenched her camis, crusted over, and drenched them again. She crawled past another candidate, collapsed and still, his face ghostly from heat stroke. Aiding him would expose her own position. She pressed forward. By mid-afternoon, she reached the final approach. A 50-meter stretch of high grass was the last obstacle before the firing point. The OP was straight ahead. Instructors were methodically scanning the field, hunting for any flicker of movement, any shape that didn't belong. She could make out Hessler up there, his binoculars sweeping the area like a hawk's. Elise seemed to dissolve into the ground, taking in the scent of soil, the feel of grass against her cheek. An ant crawled across her hand. She remained inert. She started moving with the wind. Each motion was synchronized with the swaying grass. Her ghillie suit rendered her just another feature of the landscape. When the wind paused, she froze. When it stirred, she moved. Her breathing became imperceptible, matching the earth's rhythm. It took her an hour and a half to negotiate those 50 meters. In position, she acquired her target, ranged the distance by eye rather than laser, and applied steady pressure to the trigger. The shot was flawless, a center mass hit at 420 meters, her range estimate off by less than 10. She had navigated the entire stalk completely undetected. An hour later, she was standing before Hessler as he reviewed her performance sheet. His expression was stone, but his eyes smoldered. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he began, his voice deliberate. "Your shot was dead on. Your infiltration was textbook." He paused, and Elise could feel the hammer about to fall. "But during your final 50 meters, I noted your left elbow silhouetted above the grass line on 3 separate occasions. In a combat situation, that means you're compromised." The words landed like a blow. "No observer flagged me, Master Sergeant." "I'm an observer," Hessler shot back, his tone like oil. "And I'm flagging you." He slashed a mark on his clipboard as if driving a nail into her career. "This stalk is a fail. You'll run it again tomorrow." Elise stood locked at the position of attention, her mind racing through the course SOP, searching for some regulation to counter him. She was about to protest, to challenge the obvious screwjob, but another voice intervened, Master Sergeant Hessler. Marcus Webb approached, holding his own clipboard, his stride unhurried but firm. "I was monitoring Staff Sergeant Thorne's approach from the secondary OP. I had no visual of him breaking concealment." He stood beside Elise, positioning himself as a shield between her and Hessler, making his allegiance clear. "I've already logged my observation." Webb held out a form, every field completed in precise handwriting. Hessler's jaw tightened. "Gunnery Sergeant Webb. This candidate is my responsibility, and course regulations require a senior instructor to adjudicate any disputed evaluation," Webb replied. His tone was professional, but edged with steel. "I am prepared to escalate this to the CO if necessary." The animosity between the two men was thick enough to taste. Elise saw Hessler weigh his options. saw the rage flare in his eyes as he realized he'd been checkmated in front of the very Marine he was trying to break. "Fine," Hessler snapped, the word like a crack of a whip. "The stalk is a pass." He turned to Elise, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper meant for her ears alone. "Congratulations, Staff Sergeant. You survived today." Webb offered her a brief, nearly invisible nod before walking away. Hessler watched him go. Then his gaze snapped back to her. His voice was quiet now, a violating intimacy that raised the hair on her arms. "You think you've won something?" he hissed. "You think Webb having your back means anything?" He leaned closer, and she smelled bitter coffee and something else beneath it, desperation or perhaps just pure contempt. The FEX is next. 3 days in the boonies, no one watching to save you, no rules to protect you, just you, the ground, and 100 ways to fail. His smile was a raw, predatory thing. "I've seen your type before, Staff Sergeant. The ones who think raw talent is a free ride, who think they're different." He shook his head slowly. "The field breaks every single one of them." He strode off, leaving her on the range, the Georgia sun baking her neck and the future feeling like a tombstone. That night, she was breaking down her rifle behind the barracks, hands working by muscle memory while her thoughts were consumed by the grim math of survival. 3 days in Sector 9, 72 hours for Hessler to find a mistake, any vulnerability he could tear open. The sound of boots on gravel broke her concentration. "Staff Sergeant." She glanced up. A young Marine stood a respectful distance away, a wiry kid with sandy hair and a nervous energy he hadn't yet learned to conceal. "PFC Garrett Caldwell," he said. "We're in the same squad bay." Elise gave a curt nod. She'd noticed him, the new guy who pushed too hard during PT and talked when he should have been listening. "What do you need, Private?" Caldwell shuffled his feet, clearly uncomfortable. "I saw what happened out on the range with Gunny Hessler." He paused, then the words rushed out. "I'm gonna get dropped, Staff Sergeant. My stalk is tomorrow, and I can't do it." "I don't know how to be quiet. Back home in the mountains, you make noise in the woods. You let the bears and cougars know you're coming. Being quiet is what gets you killed." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw panic. "But out here, quiet is all there is, and I don't get it." Elise assessed him. Caldwell was maybe 22, with the calloused hands of a laborer and a thick Appalachian accent. First in his family to join up, most likely. Coal country stock. The kind of young man who saw the Corps as the only way out of a dying town. "Where are you from, Private?" "Eastern Kentucky, Harlan County." Elise understood. In those mountains, noise was a shield. You broadcast your existence. Silence meant a man was down, or worse. To make him a sniper, she had to teach him to unlearn every instinct that had kept his people alive for generations. "I can't give you any official instruction," she stated. "If Hessler caught us, he'd have both of our careers." Caldwell's shoulders slumped. "But," she continued, "if you happen to be practicing your movements behind the training area after dark, and I happen to be there and offer a couple of tips, that's just one Marine looking out for another." A glimmer of hope sparked in his eyes. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant." "Don't thank me yet. Be behind the range office at 2100. Wear your ghillie." After he was gone, Elise returned to her rifle and her thoughts. She understood the gamble. Hessler was looking for any reason to get her on a fraternization charge, any pretext to have her removed. But her father's voice echoed in her head. "A real rifleman always takes care of his own, Elise. That's what makes a sniper, not just a shooter. A shooter takes lives. A sniper saves them. Sometimes that means a bullet, and sometimes it means teaching a boot how to survive." She had made a promise to her father to be the kind of Marine he was, even if it meant risking everything she'd worked for. At 9 p.m. sharp, she found Caldwell waiting in the shadows behind the range office. For 2 hours, she taught him the art of invisibility, how to interpret the terrain for cover, how to use shadows and empty spaces to disappear, how to think like prey, not a predator. The kid absorbed everything with the frantic focus of a man going under. By the time full darkness had settled, he'd changed his hide 3 times, each one an improvement on the last. They were going over observation lanes when a flashlight beam slashed the night. Hessler stepped out of the darkness, his light pinning them, framing the incriminating scene of a male and female Marine alone after hours. "Well," he said, his voice oozing with triumph, "what do we have here?" Elise was instantly on her feet, spine rigid. "Gunnery Sergeant. I was conducting some peer-to-peer training on observation." Peer training? Hessler savored the phrase, "at 2200 in a hide," with a junior male Marine. With a slow shake of his head, an icy smirk spread across his face. "That ain't the story I'm seeing, Staff Sergeant." Caldwell opened his mouth, but Hessler cut him off with a gesture. "PFC Caldwell, get to your rack. Now. We'll be talking tomorrow." He waited until the private was gone, then fixed his gaze on Elise. "Fraternization," he said, opening a small notebook. "It's a violation of MCOP 1326.2. That's an immediate course drop." He stepped closer. "I needed something concrete, Staff Sergeant. Something Gunny Webb can't magic away for you. Something in writing." His pen scratched the page. "I finally got it." Elise kept her voice steady. "Nothing improper occurred, Gunnery Sergeant. I was assisting a fellow Marine with his fieldcraft. Marine Corps Order 1500.61 specifically allows for peer instruction. An MCO that presumes the training is professional." Hessler shot back. 2200 hours. A secluded location, a recurring pattern. He snapped his notebook closed. "I'm submitting this for a formal review. Until then, you're restricted to quarters outside of training." He started to leave, then stopped. "The FEX begins in 36 hours, Staff Sergeant. You should use that time to contemplate your future, because right now, I hold it in my hands." He vanished into the darkness, leaving Elise with the sound of crickets and the immense weight of her career imploding. She moved toward the barracks on instinct, her mind racing through the certain outcomes. Hessler would see the charge through. Webb might defend her, but regulations were regulations. Even a hint of misconduct was a career ender, regardless of her sniper MOS. 8 months ago, she gave her word to a dying man. That promise was now dust, and she was helpless to hold on to it. Lying on her rack, staring into space, she overheard quiet voices from the walkway outside. 2 men speaking in low, serious tones. She knew them at once, Hessler and Cody Vance. Elise realized she had to get away. Overhearing instructors was a quicker ticket home than fraternization, but a raw, fractured quality in Hessler's voice froze her. It was a sound she had never heard from him. She moved silently to the window, staying in the shadows, and listened. "You don't understand," Hessler was saying. "You believe this is about standards? The integrity of this program? It's not. It was never about that." Vance's response was a mere whisper. "My sister, she aimed to be a ranger," Hatcher said, his voice thick with an old sorrow. 15 years ago, Caroline. She was a natural, tough, fast, smart, top of her class in boot. The brass called her the genuine article." He took a ragged breath. "She crushed the first 2 phases. Our family, the entire damn Corps, was watching. My old man claimed she'd make history. The first Hatcher in 3 generations to earn that tab." A heavy silence filled the air. "And then she broke," Hatcher whispered. "Week 5. Just fell apart. Couldn't take another step. They found her in her rack at 0300, talking to herself. A complete psychological breakdown," the shrink said. "Dissociation." Vance's voice was different when he spoke. Softer. "What became of her?" Hatcher answered. "A medical discharge. 6 months in a VA mental ward." Hatcher's voice was completely flat, the way men speak of a pain too profound for emotion. "She wasn't the same person when she got out. Lives in a group facility down in Alabama. Can't keep a job or a friend. My father refuses to even speak her name." The silence stretched. "He claims she brought dishonor to our family. To him." Thorne heard the sound of boots shifting on the floor. "Every time I see a woman in this course who thinks she has what it takes, I see Caroline," Hatcher confessed. "I see what this environment did to her, what the pressure created in her mind." His voice dropped to a broken murmur. "This isn't about cruelty, Vance. It's about preventing it from happening again." It's about protecting them from what they believe they desire. Vance said something Thorn couldn't hear. Then Hatcher's voice regained its familiar iron tone. Thorn is an exception. I see that. She has a quality most of these grunts lack. But that very quality makes her a risk. The more squared away they are, the more they push themselves. And the harder the push, the worse the crash. He paused. I'm going to offer her every exit, every opportunity to leave before this place destroys her. If she has any sense, she'll take it. Thorn stepped back from the window, her heart pounding. Hatcher wasn't just a stubborn gunny. He was a man haunted by the past, fighting a battle already over. His war against her had nothing to do with her. It was about Caroline. And 15 years of watching his sister adrift. It was about the immense guilt of his inability to save her. Understanding wasn't forgiveness. It didn't negate the inspections, the false reports, or the constant pressure to make her quit. But it illuminated the chilling source of his hostility, and it hardened her own resolve to steal. She would succeed not only for herself, but for the woman who had collapsed under a burden Thorn was now resolved to carry. The orders came at morning muster. The final field exercise commences at 0500 tomorrow, Hatcher stated, his voice like rocks grinding. 72 hours in assigned sectors, stalks, OPs, and unknown distance shots. Your score depends on stealth, accuracy, and mission success. His eyes found Thorn. Anything below 70% is a failure. He let the words sink in. Sergeant Thorn, you are assigned Sector 9. A quiet murmur spread through the formation. Sector 9 was infamous. No one ever scored above 85%. It was the sector Hatcher reserved for those he wanted gone. Across the formation, Caldwell gave her a look of pure worry. Thorn maintained a stone-faced expression, her posture perfect. She had anticipated this. That evening, she pored over a topo map from the range shack, the barracks still around her. Sector 9 was a mess of contour lines, a landscape designed for suffering. It featured brutal ridges, dense thickets, and observation posts positioned for certain failure. 72 hours in hell, but Thorn grew up in mountains that made Georgia seem like a playground. Her father taught her how to get a bearing from the stars when a compass was useless, to locate water where maps indicated none, to push on where other Marines would quit by the second day. Hatcher believed Sector 9 was his final weapon. He had no idea who he was up against. She took out the old photograph of her father. Thomas Thorn gazed back, captured forever in a Montana field, rifle in hand, a confident grin on his face. 3 more days, she whispered. 3 days to qualification. Then I make the shot nobody else can. She turned the photo over, touching the 3rd incomplete line. Asterisk, become a Marine Scout sniper. Asterisk, nearly there, Dad, she said quietly. The exercise started in the gray of dawn, candidates disappearing into their sectors like ghosts. Thorn humped her pack into Sector 9, relying on her rifle, her training, and the memory of her father. From the command tent, Hatcher followed her on screen until she was swallowed by the trees. He had sent his most difficult terrain, his toughest challenge, against her. Now he would discover if Thomas Thorn's daughter could endure it. 72 hours in Sector 9 was a continuous assault. The terrain was worse than the map depicted, harsher than the legends. Sharp rocks tore at her knees and elbows. The undergrowth was so thick she had to crawl for what seemed like miles, her pack catching, thorns ripping her uniform. Instructors held watch from every high ground, their gazes seemingly predicting her every action. But Thorn would not yield. The first day was a test of will under a sun that turned the forest into a furnace. She moved through it, finding easier routes, conserving strength, and adapting to the land. Sweat drenched her camis, dried and drenched them once more. The insects were merciless. The pack straps dug into her shoulders until the ache became background noise. By afternoon, she was at her first target, a mystery distant silhouette in a clearing 400 meters below. No laser, no partner, just her senses, her instinct, and the skills her father had drilled into her. She analyzed the subtle changes in the landscape, the target's size against the background, the slight heat haze, she estimated it at 420 meters. She adjusted for the sharp downward slope, calculated for the light crosswind, and pressed the trigger. The bullet struck 2 inches left of center. A clean hit. She logged her coordinates and continued on. Day 2 was dedicated to observation. Long hours motionless in a hide, documenting a simulated enemy camp while instructors searched for her. The immobility was its own kind of torture. Muscles cried out, and focus wavered. Thorne entered what her father called the calm, a state of heightened awareness where everything and nothing required attention. She observed, she drew, she was invisible. On the 3rd morning, she noticed the tripwire. Pulled tight at ankle level on a trail, perfectly concealed by the morning shadows. It was a training aid, certainly, but it was also a message. A snare designed for a particular Marine, Hatcher wanted to fail. Thorne stopped just short of it. She saw the wire, traced it to the trees, and knew exactly what it meant. This was a final, direct challenge. She carefully neutralized it, took a picture with her phone for proof, and moved forward. Day 3 brought the final challenge, navigating the infamous Razorback Ridge in Sector 9. A 400-meter stretch of naked stone led to the OP. That one crawl had broken every hopeful for the past 3 years. She began at dawn and only got into position 8 hours later. It took that long to crawl 400 meters. She was one with the moving shade and the breeze, a piece of the harsh Georgia landscape. Finally set, she lased her target at 680 meters out. Her hold was firm, her breath a quiet rhythm. She pressed the trigger, and the shot was away. Later, the score sheet illuminated her name above range 9, 91%, a record for the school's 40 years. Gunny Miller squinted at the board, the digits, an alien language. A faint tremor ran through the dope book he held. He faced Thorne as she approached to see her results. 91%, he mumbled. On this range, it was not praise, just hollow disbelief. The terrain is not what gets you, Gunny, she said softly. My dad taught me that. It is fear. She met his gaze. Your sister had strength, Gunnery Sergeant. The system that failed her was the problem. But I am not her, and your version of saving me will not work. She pivoted, leaving him with his clipboard and memories. The final qual day dawned hot and bright. The survivors assembled on Toddfield Range for the ultimate trial. 18 of the original 24 remained after 3 weeks. The stalk claimed 6, defeated by the land, the sun, or the pressure. Thorne stood fast, the weight of her purpose settling on her. Her father, her vow, and 3 weeks of targeted harassment. Everything hinged on today. First up was the KD range. Targets set from 200 to 800 meters. This was where shooters were separated from real snipers. Thorne executed the course like clockwork. Her breath was even, her trigger squeeze perfect. Her shots were clustered so tight, Webb's eval simply said, exceptional. She scored 98%, just behind Sergeant Jameson Kowalski. The 31-year-old was a silent pro, all steady hands and methodical action. Next was the UKD range, targets hidden on rough terrain at random distances. This tested a shooter's natural eye over pure training. The first target appeared at an estimated 340 meters. She set her scope and sent the round. A clean hit, center mass. The second popped at 580 meters. She judged the heat, shimmer, adjusted, and fired. Another strike. Through the whole course, her range calls were off by less than 10 meters. Her precision made the others pause and stare. The final stock was the last event, a slow crawl across unfamiliar ground toward a hostile OP. Thorne vanished into the foliage, emerging only when in position. Her sights settled on the observer, who was oblivious until her perfect shot gave her away. The final roster showed her name at the top of the class. Staff Sergeant Elise Thorne was now a scout sniper. But there was more. Webb led the new snipers to a legendary spot at Toddfield's edge, a place of myth. Target 17. The steel was a phantom, a flickering shape seen through a gap in the pines nearly a mile distant. This is your choice, Webb's voice sliced the silence. You do not have to shoot. It will not affect your qual. He let the offer linger, his expression knowing. But if you want to take a crack at it, now is the time. Cody Vance stepped up, all swagger. He had passed by a whisker. He got into position, radiating the false confidence of a legend in his own mind. He put on a performance, adjusting his optic and studying the flags. His first shot hit the trees, 50 meters off. The next was worse. His third flew high over the target and into the dirt wall. Vance rose, jaw tight. "Damn wind," he grumbled to no one. "Cannot get a read." He stalked away, avoiding eye contact, fists clenched. Kowalski was next. He was methodical, calm. He observed for minutes, analyzing the grass and flags with scientific precision. His shot threw dirt up just past the target. So close. Closer than anyone before, but it was still a miss. He got up, nodded once in acceptance, and walked off, a man at peace with his capabilities. "Nice try," said Webb. Kowalski nodded, expressionless. 3 others shot, all of them missed. It felt like the valley just swallowed the rounds. For 40 years, Target 17 remained clean. 847 official tries, and not a single hit. Garrett Caldwell stepped up. He had barely qualified, saved only by his stock score. He stared at the target as if his life was already over. He shot. The bullet hit the ground 20 meters shy. He corrected, firing again. Closer, but not there. His third smacked the earth just below the steel. A hell of a miss. He rose, met Thorne's gaze, and nodded. "Your turn," his eyes said. The rest had shot or declined. Only Thorne remained. Before she moved, Gunny Miller stepped into the open. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he barked, making her name sound like a crime. "Here is the one who thinks she is better than 40 years of shooters." He gestured at the range. 1,247 meters. Bad thermals, a mystery crosswind, and a firing window as wide as your body. His smile was ice. No one hits that target. The challenge hung in the thick Georgia air. All eyes were on her. Kowalski's arms were crossed. Caldwell looked tense. Vance had returned, a cocktail of jealousy and grim fascination on his face. Webb watched from the side, giving nothing away. High above, Colonel Patricia Drummond observed everything through her scope. Thorne went to the line and got down. The prone felt natural, solid. She acquired the target, a shimmering steel shape in the heat. The valley's wind flags were useless, each one contradicting the others, twisted in different directions. The gap between the pines seemed impossibly narrow. She disregarded it. She studied the grass. 200 meters out, it leaned left. At 400, it eddied from a thermal. At 600, it thrashed. By 800, the flow changed completely. She mapped the valley's invisible currents in her mind. She sensed its pulse, the heat radiating from stone, the split-second lulls between gusts. Her father's voice was in her ear, sharp and clear, as if he were beside her. "The rifle is just steel, Elise. You are the dangerous part. The lead just goes where you send it. The scope gives you the official story. Your instinct gives you the facts. Trust your gut." She adjusted her scope. 12 MOA up, 4 MOA left. The adjustment was pure instinct against all training and data, a setting no one would ever teach. Miller's voice cut in again from behind. "She will miss," he declared loudly, "for everyone's benefit. Just like the others." Thorne exhaled slowly. Her finger found the trigger. Her world narrowed to a single point. Only the target and the air remained, caught between heartbeats. She pressed. The rifle slammed into her. Its report cracked through the valley, bouncing off the far ridgeline. The bullet left the muzzle at 2,800 feet per second, beginning its journey to a target unhit for 4 decades. Thorne remained on the scope, tracking the vapor trail as it carved through the heat haze, a trajectory born of pure will. 1 second. The round passed the midpoint, still on course. 1.5 seconds. The bullet sliced the air between the trees, a phantom passing through the narrow gap. Then she heard it. The crisp, unmistakable times, ping times of impact. The sound of a flawless shot rolled back up the valley, announcing that the impossible had just happened. For a heartbeat, the range fell into a stunned silence. Then Lance Corporal Caldwell shattered it with a primal roar, punching a fist toward the sky, shouting something incoherent and triumphant. Kowalski started a slow, deliberate clap that quickly swelled into a roar of approval. Another Marine joined, then another. Within moments, the entire line was on its feet, a mixture of raw admiration and disbelief on their faces. Elise pushed herself up from the dirt, her hands steady, her breathing even. A knot of tension she'd carried for 3 brutal weeks finally dissolved. She had done it. The shot that was pure legend, the one that had washed out hopefuls for 40 years. She'd threaded around through an 8-foot aperture from over 1,200 yards away on a cold-bore rifle. Gunny Webb walked over, a look of profound respect in his eyes as he offered his hand. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," he rumbled. "In 20 years in this Corps, that's the finest shooting I've ever witnessed." He held her grip. Your dad would have been damn proud. Elise could only manage a nod, her throat tight. She saw him then, a man in a Montana canyon teaching a girl to read the wind. The Marines parted to make way for a figure striding from the observation tower. Colonel Patricia Drummond moved with the stark efficiency of a lifer, the silver eagles on her collar flashing. She was in her 50s, with iron-gray hair and a severe bun, and eyes that had seen too much to be easily swayed. She stopped directly in front of Elise, her gaze assessing. "Thorne," the colonel stated, "I was watching from the command post." She gestured toward the valley where Target 17 stood, newly scarred. "They tell me you just did something no one at this school has ever done." "Yes, ma'am." Elise's tone was unwavering. Drummond nodded slowly. "I reviewed your service record before you arrived. Top rifle scores in your unit. 2 combat deployments. A history of outstanding fitness reports." She paused. "I also read about the friction here. The resistance you encountered from certain staff." Elise remained quiet. There was nothing to add. "Be advised," Drummond continued. "I will personally review the command climate of this course. But right now, just one question." She indicated the distant steel. "How in the hell did you make a shot that has defeated every other Marine?" She could have recited ballistics, the Coriolis effect, spin drift, mirage, but that wasn't the real answer. "My father said, impossible is just a word for what hasn't been done yet," she said. "He taught me to shoot in canyons like this, to feel the wind, not just do the math." Her eyes found Target 17 again. "He passed away 8 months ago, before I got to show him I'd learned the lessons. Before I could prove they mattered, a hard lump formed in her throat. I came here to prove they meant everything." For a long moment, Drummond was silent. Then she gave a firm nod. "They were worth everything, Staff Sergeant." She turned to Webb. "Gunny, get this documented. I want that shot in the official logs." Webb's salute was crisp. "Aw yeah, Mom." As the colonel walked away, another shape detached from the crowd. Hessler. He stood there, his face a mask of cold fury. Sheer anger burned in his eyes, but underneath it lay the clear glint of defeat. He advanced toward her, each step heavy. The other Marines went quiet, watching the confrontation brew. He stopped before her, the silence thick and charged. He pulled out his clipboard, the one used to log every fabricated mistake. "Target 17, he announced, his voice a flat monotone. "Staff Sergeant Thorne, first round impact, center." He wrote the words with a rigid hand that trembled slightly. He tore the sheet off and shoved it toward Webb without looking, then faced Elise again. She braced herself for an insult, a final dig. He just stared, his eyes a confusing storm of resentment and something else she couldn't place. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel and stalked away. Caldwell was instantly at her elbow, his face lit up. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You actually, honest to God, did it. Staff Sergeant, I've never witnessed anything like it." Elise watched Hessler's rigid form disappear, the man who had tried everything to break her. The instructor, whose professional ego was so shattered he'd been forced to document his own failure in his own handwriting. "It's not finished," she said, her voice a low whisper. Caldwell looked confused. "What do you mean?" "You made the shot. You're in. What's left?" Elise met his eyes. "Graduation," she said. And whatever he has planned next, she knew men like Hessler. They didn't take a loss lying down. The next day would be the real test. But for now, she let the feeling soak in. The hard-won, absolute truth. She was going to be a Marine Corps Scout sniper, and nothing on this earth could take that from her. That night, she returned to the empty range long after the congratulations had faded. She stood on the firing line that had defined her. The valley was a wash of orange and gold in the setting sun. Target 17 was a mere speck in the distance. She pulled her father's worn photo from her pocket, holding it in the fading light. "Wish you could have seen this, Dad," she whispered. "Wish you were here." A breeze shifted through the valley, touching the grass with a language she could read better than any map. Her father had given her the instinct to see the invisible, to understand what others couldn't. She had come here to honor his legacy, to prove the girl from Montana was a warrior. She had done that and more. She had found that she wasn't just his legacy. She was her own Marine, her own woman. She flipped the photo over, looking at the faded ink. Asterisk. Elise's promises. Asterisk. 1. Graduate high school. Check. 2. Earn the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. Check. 3. Qualify Hog. She pulled a pen from her pocket and drew a firm, dark line next to the final promise. It was finished. Putting the photo away, she scanned the valley one last time. Tomorrow was the ceremony. The pin that would mark her as one of the most lethal shots in the Marine Corps. But tonight was about her, the wind, and the ghost of a shot that 40 years of institutional memory claimed was impossible. She had proven every one of them wrong. The ceremony began at 1000 hours under a sharp Quantico sky. 18 Marines stood in formation, their dress blues immaculate, their faces stoic. Family and fellow Marines filled the bleachers, cameras ready to capture the moment their own became legends. Colonel Drummond went to the podium, her gaze sweeping over the formation, fully aware of the hell they had all just survived. Today, she started, her voice carrying across the parade ground. "You enter an elite fraternity. The skills learned here will make you a terror to our enemies. The discipline you've shown will define you." She paused, her eyes on each graduate. "But I want to speak about more than skill. I want to speak about exceeding what is possible." Her eyes landed on Elise. "Every generation believes it knows the limits. We draw our lines based on what failed before. We build our walls based on what we think is true." She let the words sink in. "And then someone proves our limits were only suggestions." She took in the new scout snipers. This class had created a legend that would be told for years, born from a single round that redefined this school's limits. Her nod was pointed. "That kind of lethality isn't about one Marine. It reflects on every one of you. It establishes a new benchmark for every shooter who follows." The graduation moved with parade ground timing. Names were called, credentials given, handshakes exchanged. Each Marine marched up, received their qualification, and returned to the formation as a designated hunter of gunmen. When Thorne's name was called, the air seemed to hum. The applause was a physical wave, every eye on her. She moved forward, her spine a steel rod, knowing this moment would cement her reputation for years to come. Hessler stood by the colonel, holding the certificates. His face was a blank slate, but Thorne saw the war beneath it, the tension around his eyes, the hard set of his jaw. He was ordered to be here, to present this award to the woman he had fought for 3 weeks to eliminate. "Staff Sergeant Thorne," the colonel announced, her voice booming. "Graduating as class honor graduate." She paused. "And the first candidate in the 40-year history of this school to hit target 17? The hall thundered. After the colonel gave her the graduation certificate, he signaled for Hessler to award the commendation for her legendary shot. Hessler advanced. Their gazes locked. Time froze. Thorne saw it all in his eyes. A deep-seated bitterness that would haunt him for years. It was a raw respect he could no longer conceal. Deeper still, a trace of utter defeat, the look of a man who had fought a battle he was always meant to lose. He handed her the award, his hand brushing hers. He leaned close, his voice a gravelly whisper just for her. "Your father would be proud," he rasped. "I failed to save Caroline, but you saved yourself. Stop me from repeating that failure. He stepped away, offering his hand. She shook it. It wasn't absolution, not by a long shot. It was a truce. And for now, that was enough. Thorne fell back into the formation as the ceremony continued. More awards, more applause. When the last name was called, the colonel dismissed them, and the room exploded into a chaotic celebration. Families swarmed their new snipers. Cameras flashed. The air buzzed with pride. She hung back, watching the bedlam unfold. Kowalski was getting his shoulder hammered by a man who had to be his old man. Vance stood ramrod straight for a photo with his wife. Before Thorne could slip away, Garrett Caldwell was in front of her, grinning like he'd won the lottery. "Staff Sergeant," he said, his voice cracking, "I owe you this." He started to offer a handshake, but pulled her into a brief, awkward hug that felt more real than any salute. "You taught me more than just fieldcraft," he whispered. "You showed me what having your brother's six really means." He stepped back, his eyes shining. "Not many of us from Harlan County make it here. We did today, because of you." A lump formed in Thorne's throat. She gave a curt nod, words failing her. Caldwell gave her one last, informal salute and disappeared into the throng. Webb appeared at her elbow. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "take a walk with me." They moved from the noise toward the quiet tree line of their first meeting. "That fraternization charge," Webb began bluntly. "The CO reviewed it and threw it out this morning. Hessler's entire report was deemed garbage." Relief washed over Thorne in a powerful wave. "That's not all," Webb continued. "Hessler's been pulled from instructor duty. He's got new orders coming down." He looked her dead in the eye. "What you did wasn't just about hitting a target. You redrew the map for everyone." He turned to go, then stopped. "Every woman who comes through here after you will have an easier road because you carved the path." With that, he was gone, leaving Thorne with the Virginia pines and the weight of her achievement. She walked to her truck as the sunset painted the sky. In her wallet, her father's picture now lay next to her new certification. 3 promises were scribbled on that photo's back. Every one of them kept. Every debt settled. Thorne drove off the Quantico base as night fell, leaving behind the range where she had conquered the impossible. The barracks that had been her crucible. The Corps that had tried to break her and had lost. Thomas Thorne was finally resting easy beneath the Montana soil, and carried on the Virginia wind. His daughter was now his legacy. Staff Sergeant Thorne, a scout sniper in the United States Marine Corps, the one who made the shot. This chapter was closed, but her war had just started.